everyone, and welcome to LinkedIn Live. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of create meaning. And I'm so excited today to have my good friend and our social psychology expert here, Ron Friedman. A little bit about him. He is not only a social psychologist, he's best-selling author, one of them being Best Place to Work, and then more recently, Decoding Greatness. And I know, Ron, you're working on a third book. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes. You're also founder of Ignite 80, a learning and development company that teaches leaders science-based strategies for building high-performing teams. So welcome, Ron. It's so good to have you. And for all of our guests who are joining us, if you would, as you always do, please share in the chat where you're coming from so we can see where people are coming in from. I know that there were a number of people who are registering, coming in from all over the place. And Ron, where are you coming from?
Cosmopolitan Rochester, New York.
Nice.
Yes.
And I'm coming from San Francisco. So while people are, what's that?
Practically the same.
Practically the same. So while people are starting to join us here, tell us a little bit about your story. And I mean, I love your transition. You were an academic and then you moved into the work world. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, so I spent years as a college professor. I was teaching and doing experiments in the field of human motivation. I actually studied with DC and Ryan, who many people know from Dan Pink's book, Drive, Self-Determination Theory. And after years of teaching, I decided, you know what, I'm going to go off into the corporate world. And the reason for that is what drew me to academics is I absolutely love learning new things. And the tragedy of becoming a full-time professor is you're just teaching the same thing over and over again. And it's much harder to learn new things. And so I decided I'm going to go off into the corporate world. And when I got there, one of the things I discovered was just the massive divide between the latest science, the factors that we as psychologists know lead people to be more creative and productive and successful, and how most organizations operate. And it's everything from the way that companies hire to the way that managers motivate to the basic layout of the modern office. And so I decided I was going to write a book. And so I took a risk. I quit my job and I wrote a book in which I translated over 1,000 academic journal articles into plain English so that regardless of whether you're someone just starting out or you're a CEO, you have access to the best science of creating a high-performing team and elevating your performance at work using science.
So I think that divide is so pronounced, where there's this serious divide between what research knows versus what business does. And I was mentioning this to you earlier that kind of this real world scenario that we've got this multinational corporation and they're starting to lose some money right now, family owned. And so now the family's kind of stepping in and they're turning back on the human centric approach that they've been kind of building. The leaders have been building over the past 15 years. And they're doing a big turnaround on this where they're tightening the screws and they're saying, we've got to tighten our seatbelts here, and we've got to really kind of put an end to this human-centric kind of create meaning kind of culture that we've been building, and really get down to business. So if you were asked by this family, what would you advise them right now? They're scared. They're wanting to make sure that they continue to be profitable. What do they do? What's a better way to go?
Well, I mean, I would start by asking them a very simple question, which is, what are you optimizing for? If you're optimizing for short-term profits, then by all means, cut all of the programs and the investment you are putting into your employees. But if you're interested in long-term growth, long-term success, if you like profits, if you like retaining your top performers, if you like the idea of shrinking your turnover numbers, then you want to invest in fueling people's psychological needs. Because what we know from the research is that when people feel like they have their psychological needs fulfilled, they tend to be healthier, happier, and more productive. And that translates into profits for organizations. They don't turn over, they don't call in sick, they're more creative, they have happier customers. All of the outcomes that organizations are ultimately interested in, that's what you get when you invest in your employees and you provide them with psychologically meaningful experiences.
And, there's some really interesting parallels with my world and the world of well-being that, this understanding that really what's good for people is in fact good for the bottom line, and also essential for building a high performing team. And the same is true with really tapping into those deepest human psychological needs. So I want to pause here really quickly. We've got people coming in from Arizona, Salt Lake City, Hawaii, Walnut Creek. So thanks everybody who's joining us. And I encourage you all to ask questions as we go through this. We've got an expert here. And Ron, I just want to highlight again the fact that you are actually part of the self-determination theory team. And if there's any theory, psychological theory that's pretty well known, I would say that that's probably one of the biggest ones. And
Yeah.
so kudos to you for being part of that team. And so I know that you were part of the research. You helped to write some papers as well. You continue to write a lot. If you haven't checked out any of Ron's articles in Harvard Business Review, for example, he's got a slew of great articles there. So please ask your questions. All right. So Ron, let's start digging into this idea of creating meaning. And creating meaning means really tapping into those deepest human psychological needs. So walk us through what those deepest human psychological needs are.
Yeah, when you look at the research on what makes people most successful at work, whether that be more productive, more creative, more invested, what it comes down to is having experience that fuel their basic human psychological needs. And what are those needs? They're the needs for mastery. Some people refer to this as the need for competence, which basically comes down to feeling like you're good at your job, but also having experiences that allow you to grow at work, improving your skills, for example, feeling like you're developing as a person. That's vital. The second basic human psychological need is the need for relatedness. So feeling like you're connected to others, feeling like you're valued, respected, appreciated, all the good things that come from human connections. And the third of the psychological needs is the need for autonomy. So feeling like you have some say in how you go about doing your job. Now, unfortunately, although that sounds really simple, most organizations do a dreadful job of fueling psychological needs. And so my job is to help give leaders and their teams proven psychologically validated insights on how you can fuel people's psychological needs and thereby elevate their performance at work.
So you help to bridge that divide between what science knows versus what business does, and by really providing a roadmap for leaders around what actually fuels people to perform at higher levels, because
Yeah.
this is a commonality across organizations. All organizations, they want to have high performing teams. Managers want to be leading a high performing team. And again, getting back to that earlier scenario, I think that so often they think, oh, we're kind of falling behind here. We need to do just the opposite. And so you're really trying to steer companies and their leaders in that other direction. So again, to our listeners, please pose your questions as we go through here. So let's start first with mastery.
Mhm.
And can you just, if I'm a leader and I want to fuel my team to reach its potential, tell me a little bit more about how I would tap into this need for mastery for
Well,
my team.
yeah, probably the biggest insight that I think most leaders are missing is that if working for you is too easy, then you're probably not doing a good job. And what I mean by that is the trajectory of most jobs at most organizations is that the job is really difficult when people first arrive. And it's because they first need to figure out what's really expected of them, who the various players are within the organizations, how to navigate the organizational culture. But then after a year or two, you get it. And it's at this point that your job becomes predictable. What happens when a job becomes predictable is you tune out. You start looking for challenges outside of work. You no longer are as invested as you once were. And so one of the critical things that leaders need to do is to very strategically introduce new challenges every once in a while. And so one of the things that we're taught in business school is to look for efficiency, like that example of the company you just mentioned. They're probably looking for efficiency. And how you find efficiencies in a lot of organizations is you have people do the same thing over and over again. But efficiency is not the same thing as engagement. You can't be fully engaged at work if you're not being challenged on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't mean overwhelming people with new challenges. That leads to burnout. That's not a good idea. What you need to do is ensure that they're in their zone of development, that they're learning new things without it feeling overwhelming. And often what that comes down to is the conversations that a manager has with his or her team. And one of the things I teach leaders is how to have that mastery meeting with your teammates so that you understand where they fall, on their trajectory, and then identify key ways of introducing new challenges without overwhelming them. And it's a learnable skill. You can elevate your team's performance once you understand what it takes to figuring out how to provide new challenges without overwhelming them.
And you know what's so interesting about this, Ron? So, for everyone who's listening, and Ron, you already know this, I'm a former public high school teacher. And so much of what you're talking about is exactly what teachers are trained to do, which is to really tap into that zone of proximal development and provide the support that students need and enough challenge so that they're continuing to learn. And, I once heard somebody say to me, a great manager is a great teacher, or sometimes people talk about how great managers are great coaches.
Mhm.
But again, that striking that balance between enough support but also enough challenge, and so that people don't get kind of start to check out. So I'm curious if you think that some of what's happening with quiet quitting, with the great resignation, is tied to the fact that people just aren't learning enough, that they're not having enough opportunities to demonstrate mastery.
I think that's exactly right. There's a recent study showing that 87% of the people who switched jobs during the Great Resignations did so because they weren't learning at work. And so, again, if we're optimizing for efficiency, which we're tempted to do, particularly at public companies, we are overlooking one of the key factors that drives engagement. And so we're unintentionally undermining our teams and undermining performance. And so you need to be very strategic in figuring out what's the thing that's going to get my employees motivated. And, they may not do a great job immediately out of the gate, but that's how we learn. We learn by attempting new things and taking feedback on how we can improve our performance the next time. That's how learning happens. But if we're terrified about taking new risks, or if we don't have the opportunity to fail, we simply don't learn. And again, that ends up leading to disengagement and what we now describe as quiet quitting.
And it's so interesting, and we're going to move on to relatedness in just a moment. But I see so often where there's a divide between some employees in the same company who are given the opportunity, for example, to engage in these passion projects where they're really having an opportunity to challenge themselves and to learn things that and go deeper in their strengths. And then others in that same company aren't given that same opportunity. And
Mhm.
big surprise, those employees who aren't given that opportunity, they're more disengaged. So again, kind of that disconnect between what research knows versus what business does. Let's talk a little bit about relatedness now. And in particular, there's a Deloitte study that just came out showing that another top reason why people are leaving or they're quietly quitting
Mhm.
is because they feel disrespected at
Mm.
work. And to me, that seems to tie really closely with with relatedness and feeling connected to one another.
Yeah, I haven't read that particular study, but without question, feeling appreciated goes a very long way. And you know about the study that I conducted recently on looking at what high performing teams do differently. And one of the ways that let me just give a little background on how we did that study. So we interviewed over 1,000 office workers in the US, and then we had them rate their team's effectiveness on a scale of 1 to 10. And we also asked them, how does your team's performance rate relative to other teams in your industry? And then we took the people who rated their team a 10 out of 10 on both of those items, and we classified them as high performing teams. And then we compared their behaviors to everyone that didn't make the cut, everyone who is a member of an average team. And what we found is that there are very key hallmarks that define high performing teams, and they all come down to relatedness. And so, one of the things we found, for example, is that they use the phone 60% more often than average teams. And it's because when you pick up the phone, when you're not afraid to talk to your colleagues, that leads to better connections and also fewer misunderstandings.
Mhm.
Another key factor that
And
we
can I
ended up
just add,
with.
I hate email and I love phone calls. I'm old school, but to your point, whenever you communicate via email, especially if it's more sensitive, more charged topics,
Mhm.
there's so much more room for misunderstanding. And if you just communicate by phone, then it's a much better way to reduce that misunderstanding, but also to build the relationship as well.
Exactly right. And there's research showing that people misperceive what or mispredict what a phone call is going to feel like. And this is particularly true with younger generations where they assume that picking up the phone is going to lead to awkwardness or an uncomfortable conversation. But what research has actually shown is that picking up the phone and having a conversation actually no more awkward than just sending an email. And yet it leads to all of these benefits, including closer connections. Back to the study, the other things that we found within that study is that people in high performing teams receive more appreciation from their teams. So that's critical to what you just described, right? Is
Mhm.
having that appreciation. And they also give more appreciation to their team members. And that tells us something critical, which is that within high performing teams, appreciation isn't something that just flows from the top down. It's delivered in peer to peer interactions. And so it's part of the culture. Appreciation is part of the culture. And that's why fueling relatedness is so, so vital. It's one of the best tools leaders have for retaining their top performers is fueling those close connections. And I talk about this in my keynote, which is in my personal experiences, I've been in organizations where logically I knew it was time to go. There was no opportunity for upper mobility. I'd kind of contributed all I was going to contribute. I knew I should move on, but I didn't move on. And the reason for that is because my team and I were working on an important project and I didn't want to leave them in a lurch. And so, this idea of loyalty to a company, for better or for worse, that's antiquated in today's day and age. But having that connection and having that loyalty to our friends, that's never going to go away because that's hardwired into who we are as human beings. And so again, one of the smartest things you can do as a leader is to fuel those close connections.
And not only close connections, but actually best friends at work. And, I've worked in really dysfunctional schools, for example, and I've had a best friend and we've done these incredible projects together. And it's always felt kind of like a safe harbor that I have there. It's also interesting what you're bringing up, and something that I talk about a lot as well is just how much culture lives within the team, not across the organization. And so I think a lot of times team leaders perceive culture as something that only senior leaders can shape. But in fact, the team leaders are the key drivers of culture, of what their team members experience in terms of their day in and day out culture is what they create within the team.
I couldn't agree more. Culture is created by the things that the leaders pay attention to and the things that they ignore. And it's because people are watching the leader more frequently than they are other people within the organization. And so as a leader, if you highlight certain behaviors, certain tendencies, certain routines, certain outcomes, that's going to be paid much more attention to than if you don't, and if you just let it kind of be. And so, one of the examples I give in the best place to work is if you're a leader and all you're focused on is winning new clients at the expense of paying attention to the quality that you put out in your products, product quality is going to sink and people are going to keep paying. It essentially becomes a sales organization. And so it's really critical that you highlight certain metrics within your meetings to demonstrate that you care about them, because those are the things that are going to be paid attention to. So, if you're trying to lift customer service numbers, talk about those numbers at meetings. That's going to go a long way towards demonstrating that you care about them, as opposed to just looking at things like profits and deliverables.
So when we talk about this topic of relatedness, and again, for our listeners, please bring in your questions if you'd like to ask them. This ties so much to this whole conversation around mental health in the workplace, and how do we tackle this taboo topic of mental health in the workplace. So there's been a lot of conversation by people like myself around how we need to revisit some old-fashioned notions, such as when we come to work, whether it's in person or virtual, that we, quote, check our emotions at the door. I'm particularly interested, talking about those younger workers where, for example, there was a Monster Intelligence survey recently came out showing that 91% of younger workers, they want to be having conversations with their manager about their mental health. But meanwhile, we've got another survey that came out from Paychex showing that over half are afraid to talk about their mental health with their boss. Now, connected to all of that, we're starting to kind of like break the doors open around this. I wanted to ask you about that op-ed piece that came out in the New York Times, which is, please don't bring your whole self to work. So kind of hand in hand with these, let's start to have more open conversations. Let's start to bring our full authentic self to work. And this op-ed piece was saying like, no, please don't. So what are your thoughts on that, particularly as it correlates with relatedness?
So, it's really interesting because I can relate to many of the issues that author is railing against. I think the point that she's making is she's talking about how in many organizations you feel coerced to open up about things maybe you don't want to talk about.
Mm.
And in some organizations, you have people who overshare about things that have absolutely nothing to do with work. And so, particularly if you're old school, those ideas did not exist. And I remember because I used to work in a real office, and that just is not something that was encouraged. And yet today, we're being asked to open up, and sometimes people are doing so to just an effect that isn't to a magnitude that isn't really helpful. And so I can appreciate that. But what I think the author misses, and this is where and I know because I've conducted the research, is that authenticity at work contributes to higher performance. And
Mhm.
the reason I mention that is going back to the study I talked about that was featured in HBR. One of the other findings we found about high performing teams is that members of high performing teams tend to be more authentic at work, which means they express more positive emotion. They tend to use exclamation points more often in
Mhm.
emails. They tend to include gifts sometimes. They tend to tease their coworkers, but they also express more negative emotions. So they surprisingly curse more often. They express more sarcasm. And when things aren't going well, they let their teammates know. Now, that would appear to fly in the face of what that op-ed is about. Like, how can being authentic contribute to higher performance? And the answer to that is simple. It's because the alternative to expressing negative emotions at work is suppressing negative emotion at work. And suppression is cognitively expensive. It means devoting mental resources to hiding the way you feel from your coworkers. And that takes cognitive bandwidth away from actually doing a good job at the office. And so the takeaway isn't that you should try to censor the way that you feel at work. It's actually the takeaway here is that when people have the psychological safety to bring their full self to work, to be themselves with their colleagues and having the safety to be themselves, that's when teams perform at a higher level. And so, what we should be focused on is providing people with the psychological safety to express the way they feel. And that doesn't, at the same time, does not mean that we should coerce people into having these awkward icebreakers when they need to open up with their colleagues, because that's not how relationships are built. They're built through shared experiences, shared goals, having the opportunity to work together towards meaningful objectives. That's when you have an organic approach to relatedness. It's not through forcing people to do things they don't want to do.
I worked with a medical department once, Ron, and I think that the intention was good. They were trying to build psychological safety. They were trying to improve the culture. And so they thought it would be a good idea to kick off meetings with this round robin exercise. But
Mhm.
they gave everybody the opportunity to be able to pass. So they would, lob the prompt, whatever it was. What's a good thing that happened today? And then what would happen is people were told that they could pass if they wanted. And so this round robin was just the prompt was lobbed, and then it would go pass, 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 all the way around the circle. And so when I started working with them, I was like, that round robin thing, stop. Don't do that ever again.
Yeah.
And, kind of to your point, though, about psychological safety, what if they just said, provided the same prompt and then had people turn to a partner? There's
Mm,
more psychological safety there. It starts to build the culture, but in a safer way. So let's
that's really
talk.
funny.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I know, I love that. I love that anecdote, and I think that you and I could probably share. Like, we could do a whole show on just like things not to do in the workplace.
Right?
I mean, it's a really interesting example of how something really well intentioned backfires when you're forgetting to think about how things appear. So another thing that I've seen organizations do, which is a definite no-no, is to invite people in a public forum to share things they don't think are going well. And all that does is it socializes the idea that things are just terrible at this organization. It's well intentioned, but it's a great example of how when you don't know how to apply the science correctly about like what should be shared publicly versus privately, you can actually end up doing more harm than good.
Okay, so I know we haven't, and we're getting a comment here from Caroline. Thank you so much. I'd sign up for that. Um, we haven't kind of done a deep dive into autonomy yet, but I want to take a moment to talk with you a little bit about purpose
Mhm.
and, really kind of compelling leaders to start leading with purpose and to bring this to their team members to help team members identify what their purpose is. Is that a good idea? And are there some unintended consequences that happen with that?
Well, I think there's value in giving people the raw materials for why their work is valuable and why it
Mhm.
has impact. Telling that story, for sure, is useful because it allows people to tell themselves a story about why their work has value and why they're, enduring and sacrificing and doing the work that they're doing. What and by the way, that's especially true for knowledge workers, where
Mm,
a lot of times what happens is it feels like you're working in an email factory, where
mhm.
your child asks you at the end of the day, "What did you do today?" And you try to scan back to what you did. It's like, well, I wrote a lot of emails, and that doesn't really impress anyone, least of all yourself. And so, knowing how your work has impact is useful. However, what that is not a substitute for is fueling people's psychological needs. And the reason I say that is because I might know that I'm writing, for example, all of these books, and that these books are improving people's lives, and that's great. But if I feel like I'm forced to do it, or if I feel lonely and I don't feel respected or valued by the people around me, or if I don't feel like I'm growing while doing that job, I'm not going to be happy. And if I'm not going to be happy, I'm not going to be engaged. And so I think that a lot of leaders are well intentioned in trying to provide purpose and trying to provide meaning. However, what we forget is that if we're doing that in the absence of fueling their psychological needs, or if we're doing it and forgetting the fact that purpose and meaning are subjective, right? So
Mm.
what might be meaningful to you as a corporation might not be meaningful to me as an individual. I think that that is effort that could be used elsewhere.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about, before we start to wrap up here, about autonomy. I mean, for starters, I think it's so fascinating that one of the biggest drivers of stress is lack of autonomy.
Mhm.
And all these companies that are like, give us some tips for people are burned out, they're stressed out, give them some tips to become more resilient. But really, the problem is that there's a lack of autonomy. So walk us through a little bit about around that and what team leaders can be thinking about doing.
Yeah, well, first let's clarify, I think, a common misconception, and autonomy is not control. So if I say to you, hey, I feel no autonomy at work, that doesn't mean I have no control over work. What it does mean is that my perception is I don't feel like I have choice, or I don't endorse what I'm doing. I don't feel like it's a good use of my time. So I might have a lot of choice in one area where I don't feel like the work is valuable. That's not going to contribute to my autonomy because I still have to do that task that I don't think is valuable. So really what autonomy is about is fueling the perception of choice, feeling like getting people to buy into the work that they're doing. And what autonomy ultimately is driven by, it's by the way that leaders communicate. It's not about the task itself. It has more to do with the way that the leader communicates. So, how do you fuel people's experience of autonomy? Well, one very simple thing that you can do, and this is one of the things that we teach leaders how to do in our workshops, etc., is providing people with a rationale for why what they're doing is valuable and meaningful and important. And that can come from a variety of sources. It could come from the person at the end, the recipient at the end, the outcome that you're having on their life. It could be a story you tell about the value it brings to the team or the organization. It could be about the value that it has for the person's career. All of those are stories that you can give, you can deliver when providing a rationale. And a lot of times as leaders, we just assume that our teams know why what they're doing is important or
Mm.
valuable, but they don't. They're not part of the same conversations as we are. They're not reading the same memos. They're not in the same meetings. And so starting off with a rationale every time is really, really valuable because it fuels people's sense of autonomy. Because again, they can tell themselves a story about why what they're doing is important.
And it's interesting you're saying that it really ties to purpose without it, people feeling like they're getting hit over the head with it. Like, what's your purpose? Instead,
Correct.
it's more about, okay, here's the rationale around why we're doing this. And it kind of allows people to organically just start to think about what their purpose is without it being so directed.
100%. And I think that the mistake that organizations are often making is that doing the job itself is really, really draining. But
Mm.
then the organization is telling me a story about how many lives we're impacting. I'm like, well, this job still sucks. It doesn't help me. And so we need to really focus on the psychological needs, and embedded within the psychological needs, naturally and organically, people are going to be able to tell themselves a story about why what they're doing is important.
So, Ron, one of the takeaways that I'm taking from our conversation, there are so many of them, but one of them being just that the need to fuel these deep psychological needs, but at the same time to do it in a more organic way. So can you give us quick 3 calls to action for our listeners to wrap us up?
There's so much I can tell you. And in anticipation of not being able to tell you all of them, I have an ebook where I share 10 strategies for building high performing teams. And I think Alana has that link to put in the chat. My first takeaway is check out that book, because we've got a lot of good tips there and very actionable, very simple things, all leveraging the science. But something we didn't talk about, which I think would be good to maybe have in a future conversation, is talking about the impact of exercise on well-being. And obviously you're an expert on this, so I don't need to tell you. But one of the things that I talk to leaders about often is reframing exercise and downtime, not as something you selfishly do for yourself, but as an investment in your future performance. And which kind of bridges us to our third takeaway, which is modeling the behaviors. And so it's not just about what you do on your own time, it's also modeling the right behaviors when it comes to prioritizing your health, prioritizing your downtime, and sharing that with your team, talking about that, because it socializes it, it normalizes it. And the opposite of that, and this is what a lot of organizations do, is they gesture towards all of these things that we think contribute to high performance, but really don't. Like, for example, having a ping pong table, which sounds really nice when you're thinking about working at an organization. But then if the leaders don't use it, then there's a stigma associated with that ping pong table, because it's what slackers do during real work time. And so modeling the right behaviors is so vital. And so I guess that would be my third takeaway.
And again, that downloadable, which I downloaded yesterday, it's awesome. 10 counterintuitive science-based secrets to leading high-performing teams is awesome. And I think that counterintuitive word there is really operative, because I think so many of these are counterintuitive, bringing us back to this story that we opened up with that multinational corporation that's kind of trying to figure out, how do we boost our performance here? And the tendency is to kind of go back to old school. So Ron, tell us how people can stay in touch with you.
The best way is to go to my website, ignite80.com, and either download that ebook or just join the Best Ideas of the Month, which is our monthly newsletter. And by the way, the reason we're called Ignite 80 is because over 80% of employees are not fully engaged at work. And so my mission and the mission of Ignite 80 is to help leaders bridge the divide between science and the workplace by giving them some very practical strategies for fueling high performance among their team. So ignite80.com, and obviously let's connect on LinkedIn.
Awesome. So up next, we've got Aaron Hurst, who's going to be making a case for purpose. He's founder of Imperative, author of The Purpose Economy. That's going to be happening on November 1st. Larry Green, who is the global program manager at Google, will be joining us on November 16th. And with that, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who joined us today for our conversation with Ron. Please follow Ron. He's amazing. His articles are awesome. I read your articles all the time. I read your books, Ron. They're so helpful. So Ron, thank you so much for being my guest today. And I do look forward to future conversations. And so for everyone else, we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks again for joining us.
Bye, everyone.